Joelle used to like to get really high and then clean. Now she was finding she just liked to clean. She dusted the top of the fiberboard dresser she and Nell Gunther shared. She dusted the oval top of the dresser's mirror's frame and cleaned off the mirror as best she could. She was using Kleenex and stale water from a glass by Kate Gompert's bed. She felt oddly averse to putting on socks and clogs and going down to the kitchen for real cleaning supplies. She could hear the noise of all the post-meeting nighttime residents and visitors and applicants down there. She could feel their voices in the floor. When the dental nightmare tore her upright awake, her mouth was open to scream out, but the scream was Nell G down in the living room, whose laugh always sounds like she's being eviscerated. Nell preempted Joelle's own scream. Then Joelle cleaned. Cleaning is maybe a form of meditation for addicts too new in recovery to sit still. The five-woman scarred wood floor had so much grit all over, she could sweep a pile of grit together with just an unappliqued bumper sticker she'd won at BYP. Then she could use damp Kleenex to get up most of the pile. She had only Kate G's little bedside lamp on, and she wasn't listening to any YYY tapes, out of consideration for Charlotte Treat, who was unwell and missed her Saturday night lively meeting on Pat's OK and was now asleep, wearing a sleep mask, but not her foam earplugs. Expandable foam earplugs were issued to every new Ennet resident, for reasons the staff would clarify for them real quick, but Joelle hated to wear them. They shut out exterior noise, but they made your head's pulse audible, and your breath sounded like someone in a spacesuit. And Charlotte Treat, Kate Gompert, April Cortelyou, and the former Amy Johnson had all felt the same way. April said the foam plugs made her brain itch. It had started with Orin and Incandenza, the cleaning, when relations were strained, or she was seized with anxiety at the seriousness and possible impermanence of the thing in the back base co-op. The getting high and cleaning became an important exercise, like creative visualization, a preview of the discipline and order with which she could survive alone if it came to that. She would get high and visualize herself solo in a dazzling, clean space, every surface twinkling, every possession in place. She saw herself being able to pick, say, dropped popcorn up off the rug and ingest it with total confidence. An aura of steely independence surrounded her when she cleaned the co-op, even with the little whimpers and anxious moans that excited her writhing mouth when she cleaned high. The place had been provided nearly gratis by Jim, who said so little to Joelle on their first several meetings that Orin kept having to reassure her that it wasn't disapproval. Himself was missing the part of the human brain that allowed for being aware enough of other people to disapprove of them, Orin had said, or dislike. It was just how the Mad Stork was. Orin had referred to Jim as himself, or the Mad Stork, family nicknames, both of which gave Joelle the creeps even then. It had been Orin who introduced her to his father's films. The work was then so obscure, not even local students of serious film knew the name. The reason Jim kept forming his own distribution companies was to ensure distribution. He didn't become notorious until after Joelle had met him. By then, she was closer to Jim than Orin had ever been, part of which caused part of the strains that kept the Brownstone co-op so terribly clean. She'd barely thought consciously of any Incandenzas for 4 years before Don Gately, who for some reason kept bringing them bubbling up to mind. They were the second saddest family Joelle had ever seen. Orin felt Jim disliked him to the precise extent that Jim was even aware of him. Orin had spoken about his family at length, usually at night, on how no amount of punting success could erase the psychic stain of basic fatherly dislike, failure to be seen or acknowledged. Orin had no idea how banal and average his same-sex parent issues were. He'd felt they were some hideous exceptional thing. Joelle had known her mother didn't much like her from the first time her own personal daddy'd told her he'd rather take Pokey to the pictures alone. Much of the stuff Orin had said about his family was dull, gone stale from years of never daring to say it. He credited Joelle with some strange generosity for not screaming and fleeing the room when he revealed the banal stuff. Pokey had been Joelle's family nickname, though her mother had never called her anything but Joelle. The Orin she knew first felt his mother was the family's pulse and center, a ray of light incarnate, with enough depth of love and open maternal concern to almost make up for a father who barely existed, parentally. Jim's internal life was to Orin a black hole, Orin said, his father's face any room's fifth wall. Joelle had struggled to stay awake and attentive, listening, letting Orin get the stale stuff out. Orin had no idea what his father thought or felt about anything. He thought Jim wore the opaque, blank facial expression his mother in French sometimes jokingly called le masque. The man was so blankly and irretrievably hidden that Orin said he'd come to see him as like autistic, almost catatonic. Jim opened himself only to the mother. They all did, he said. She was there for them all, psychically. She was the family's light and pulse, and the center that held tight. Joelle could yawn in bed without looking like she was yawning. The children's name for their mother was the Moms, as if there were more than one of her. His younger brother was a hopeless retard, Orin had said. Orin recalled the Moms used to tell him she loved him about 100 times a day. It nearly made up for himself's blank stare. Orin's basic childhood memory of Jim had been of an expressionless stare from a great height. His mother had been really tall, too, for a girl. He'd said he'd found it secretly odd that none of the brothers were taller. His retarded brother was stunted to about the size of a fire hydrant, Orin reported. Joelle cleaned behind the filthy room's radiator as far as she could reach, being careful not to touch the radiator. Orin described his childhood's mother as his emotional son. Joelle remembered her own personal daddy's Uncle T.S. talking about how her own personal daddy thought his own mama hung the goddamn moon, he'd said. The radiators on Enid House's female side stayed on at all times, 24/7, 365. At first, Joelle had thought Ms. Avril Incandenza's high-watt maternal love had maybe damaged Orin by bringing into sharper relief Jim's remote self-absorption, which would have looked, by comparison, like neglect or dislike. That it had maybe made Orin too emotionally dependent on his mother. Why else would he have been so traumatized when a younger brother had suddenly appeared, specially challenged from birth and in need of even more maternal attention than Orin? Orin, late one night on the co-op's futon, recalled to Joelle his skulking in and dragging a waste basket over and inverting it next to his infant brother's special crib, holding a heavy box of Quaker oats high above his head, preparing to brain the needy infant. Joelle had gotten an A in developmental psych the semester before, and also dependent psychology. Orin, it seemed, or even metaphysically. Orin said he'd grown up, first in a regular house in Weston, and then at the academy in Enfield. Grown up dividing the human world into those who were open, readable, trustworthy, versus those so closed and hidden that you had no clue what they thought of you, but could pretty damn well imagine it couldn't be anything all that marvelous, or else why hide it? Orin had recounted that he'd started to see himself getting closed and blank and hidden like that as a tennis player toward the end of his junior career, despite all the mom's frantic attempts to keep him from hiddenness. Joelle had thought of BU's Nickerson Fields, 30,000 voices openly roared endorsement, the sound rising with the punt to a kind of amniotic pulse of pure positive noise, versus tennis's staid and reserved applause. It had all been so easy to figure and see, then, listening, loving Orin and feeling for him, poor little rich and prodigious boy. All this was before she came to know Jim and the work. Joelle scrubbed at the discolored square of fingerprints around the light switch until the wet Kleenex disintegrated into greebles. Never trust a man on the subject of his own parents. As tall and basso as a man might be on the outside, he nevertheless sees his parents from the perspective of a tiny child, still, and will always. And the unhappier his childhood was, the more rested will be his perspective on it. She's learned this through sheer experience. Greebles had been her own mother's word for the little bits of sleepy goo you got in your eyes' corners. Her own personal daddy called them eye boogers and used to get them out for her with the twisted corner of his hanky. Though it's not as if you could trust parents on the subject of their memory of their children either. The cheap glass shade over the ceiling's light was black with interior grime and dead bugs. Some of the bugs looked like they might have been from long extinct species. The loose grime alone filled half an empty carefree box. The more stubborn crud would take a scouring pad and ammonia. Joelle put the shade aside for until she'd got down to the kitchen to toss out different boxes of crud and wet Kleenex and grab some serious chore-type supplies from under the sink. Orin had said she was the third neatnickest person he knew after his mom's and a former player he'd played with obsessive-compulsive disorder, dual diagnosis, with which the UHID membership was rife. But at the time, the import had missed her. At that time, it had never occurred to her that Orin's pull toward her could have had anything, either pro or con, to do with his mother. Her biggest worry was that Orin was pulled only by what she looked like, which her personal daddy'd warned her the sweetest syrup draws the nastiest flies, so to watch out. Orin hadn't been anything like her own personal daddy. When Orin was out of the room, it had never seemed like a relief. When she was home, her own daddy never seemed to be out of the room for more than a few seconds. Her mother said she hardly even tried to talk to him when his pokey was home. He kind of trailed around from room to room, kind of pathetically, talking batons and low pH chemistry. It was like when she exhaled, he inhaled, and vice versa. He was all through the house. He was real present at all times. His presence penetrated a room and outlasted him there. Orin's absence, whether for class or practice, emptied the co-op out. The place seemed vacuumed and buffed sterile before the cleaning even started. When he went, she didn't feel lonely in the place without him, but she did feel alone. What alone was going to feel like, and she, no one's fool. Footnote 305. She thought then. End of footnote 305. Was erecting fortifications real early into it. It was Orin, of course, who'd introduced them. He'd had this stubborn idea that himself would want to use her in the work. She was too pretty for somebody not to want to arrange, capture. Better himself than some weak-chinned academic. Joelle had protested the whole idea. She had a brainy girl's discomfort about her own beauty and its effect on folks, a caution intensified by the repeated warnings of her personal daddy. Even more to the immediate point, her filmic interest lay behind the lens. She'd do the capturing, thank you very much. She wanted to make things, not appear in them. She had a student filmmaker's vague disdain for actors. Worst, Orin's idea's real project was developmentally obvious. He thought he could somehow get to his father through her. That he pictured himself having weighty, steeple-fingered conversations with the man, Joelle's appearance, and performance the subjects. A three-way bond. It made her real uneasy. She theorized that Orin unconsciously wished her to mediate between himself and himself, just as it sounded like his mother had. She was uneasy about the excited way Orin predicted that his father wouldn't be able to resist using her. She was extra uneasy about how Orin referred to his father as himself. It seemed painfully blatant, developmental arrest-wise. Plus, she felt only a little less than she made it sound on the futon at night, protesting. She'd felt uneasy at the prospect of any sort of connection with the man who had hurt Orin so, a man so monstrously tall and cold and remotely hidden. Joelle heard a howl and a crash from the kitchen, followed by McDade's tubercular laugh. Twice, Charlotte Treat sat up in sleep, glistening with fever, and said in a flat, dead voice something that sounded, for all the world, like trances in which she did not breathe, and then fell back, out. Joelle was trying to pin down a queer, rancid cinnamon smell that came from the back of a closet stuffed with luggage. It was especially hard to clean when you weren't supposed to be allowed to touch any other resident's stuff. She might have known from the work. The man's work was amateurish, she'd seen, when Orin had had his brother, the unretarded one, lend them some of the Mad Stork's read-only copies. Was amateurish the right word? More like the work of a brilliant optician and technician who was an amateur at any kind of real communication. Technically gorgeous, the work, with lighting and angles planned out to the frame, but oddly hollow, empty, no sense of dramatic towardness, no narrative movement toward a real story, no emotional movement toward an audience, like conversing with a prisoner through that plastic screen using phones. The upperclassman Molly Notkin had said of Incandenza's early oeuvre. Joelle thought them more like a very smart person conversing with himself. She thought of the significance of the moniker himself, cold, prenuptial agreement of heaven and hell, mordant, sophisticated, campy, hip, cynical, technically mind-bending, but cold, amateurish, hidden. No risk of empathy with the job-like protagonist, whom she felt like the audience was induced to regard like somebody sitting atop a dunk tank. The lampoons of inverted genres, archly funny and sometimes insightful, but with something provisional about them, like the finger exercises of someone promising, who refused to really sit down and play something to test that promise. Even as an undergrad, Joelle had been convinced that parodists were no better than camp followers in iron masks. Satires, usually the work of people with nothing new themselves to say. Footnote 306. Some of her and Jim's best arguments had been over the connotations of everybody's a critic, which Jim had liked to repeat with all different shades and pitches of ironic double edge. End of footnote 306. The Medusa versus the Odalisque, cold, elusive, inbent, hostile, the only feeling for the audience one of contempt, the meta-audience in the film's theater presented as objects long before they turned to blind stone. But there had been flashes of something else, even in the early oeuvre, before himself made the leap to narratively anti-confluential but unironic melodrama she helped prolong the arc of, where he dropped the technical fireworks and tried to make characters move, however inconclusively, and showed courage, abandoned everything he did well, and willingly took the risk of appearing amateurish, which he had. But even in the early work, flashes of something, very hidden and quick, almost furtive. She noticed them only when alone, watching, without Orin, and his rheostats dimmer, the living room's lights up high like she liked them. Liked to see herself and everything else in the room with the viewer. Orin liked to sit in the dark and enter what he watched, his jaw slackening, a child raised on multi-channel cable TV. But Joelle began, on repeated viewing, whose original purpose was to study how the man had blocked out scenes. For an advanced storyboard course, she went the extra click in. She began to see little flashes of something. The M versus O's 3 quick cuts to the sides of the gorgeous combatants' faces, twisted past recognition with some kind of torment. Each cut to a flash of pained face had followed the crash of a petrified spectator toppling over in her chair. 3 split seconds, no more, of glimpses of facial pain, and not pain at wounds. They never touched each other, whirling with mirrors and blades. The defenses of both were impenetrable. More like as if what their beauty was doing to those drawn to watch it ate them alive, up there on stage, the flashes seemed to suggest. But just 3 flashes, each almost subliminally quick. Accidents? But not one shot or cut in the whole queer cold film was accidental. The thing was clearly S-boarded frame by frame. Must have taken hundreds of hours. Astounding technical anality. Joelle kept trying to pause the cartridge on the flashes of facial torment, but these were the early days of interlaced cartridges, and the pause still distorted the screen just enough to keep her from seeing what she wanted to study. Plus, she got the creepy feeling the man had upped the film speed in these few frame human flashes to thwart just such a study. It was like he couldn't help putting human flashes in, but he wanted to get them in as quickly and unstudyable as possible, as if they compromised him somehow. Orin and Incandenza had been only the second boy ever to approach her in a male-female way. Footnote 307. Joelle Van Dyne and Orin and Incandenza each remember themselves as the original approachee. It's unclear which, if either's memory is accurate, though it's noteworthy that this is one of only 2 total times Orin had perceived himself as the approachee, the other being the Swiss hand model, on whose nude flank he's been furiously tracing infinity signs all during the moment subject's absence. End of footnote 307. The first had been shiny-chinned and half-blind on Everclear Punch, an all-Kentucky lineman for the Shiny Prize biting Shotes team back in Shiny Prize, Kentucky, at a cookout to which the boosters had invited the pep and baton girls, and the lineman had looked like a little shy boy, as he confessed, by way of apologizing for almost splashing her when he threw up. That she was just too goddamn all-petrifyingly pretty to approach any other way but liquored up past all horror. The lineman had confessed the whole team's paralyzing horror of the prettiness of varsity Pep's top twirler, Joelle. Orin confessed to his private name for her. The memory of that HS afternoon remained real strong. She could smell the mesquite smoke and the blue pines and the yard guard spray, hear the squeals of the stock they butchered and cleaned in symbolic prep for the opener against the N. Pudica Technical HS Rivermen. She could still see the swooning lineman, wet-lipped and confessing, keeping himself upright against an immature blue pine until the blue pine's trunk finally gave way with a snap and crash. Until that cookout and confession, she'd somehow thought it was her own personal daddy, somehow, discouraging dates and male-female approaches. The whole thing had been queer and lonely until she'd been approached by Orin, who made no secret of the fact that he had balls of unrejectable steel, where horrifyingly pretty girls were concerned. But it wasn't even the subjective identification she felt, watching. She felt, somehow, for the flashes and seeming non-sequiturs that betrayed something more than cold-hip technical abstraction. Like, for example, the 240-second motionless low-angle shot of Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which, yes, ground prenuptial, dramatic movement to an annoying halt and added nothing that a 15 or 30-second still shot wouldn't have added just as well. But on the 5th or 6th reviewing, Joelle started to see the 4-minute motionless shot as important for what was absent. The whole film was from the alcoholic sandwich bag salesman's POV. Footnote 308 equals point of view, and the alcoholic sandwich bag salesman, or rather his head, was on screen every moment, even when split-screened against the Titanic Celestial Marathon 7-card stud with tarot cards game. His rolling eyes and temples, dense and rosary of upper lip sweat was imposed non-stop on the screen and viewer. Except for the 4 narrative minutes, the alcoholic sandwich bag salesman stood in the Vittorio's Bernini room, and the climactic statue filled the screen and pressed against all 4 edges. The statue, the sensuous presence of the thing, let the alcoholic sandwich bag salesman escape himself. His tiresome, ubiquitous, involuted head, she saw, was the thing. The 4-minute still shot maybe wasn't just a heavy art gesture or audience hostile hearing. freedom from one's own head, one inescapable POV. Joelle started to see here, oblique to the point of being hidden, an emotional thrust, since the mediated transcendence of self was just what the apparently decadent statue of the orgasmic nun claimed for itself as subject. Here, then, after studious and admittedly kind of boring review, was an unironic, almost moral thesis to the campy abstract mordant cartridge. The film's climactic statue's stasis presented the theoretical subject as the emotional effect, self-forgetting as the grail, and, in a covert gesture, almost moralistic, Joelle thought as she glanced at the roomlit screen, very high, mouth writhing as she cleaned, presented the self-forgetting of alcohol as inferior to that of religion/art, since the consumption of bourbon made the salesman's head progressively swell, horrendously, until by the film's end its dimensions exceeded the frame, and he had a nasty and humiliating time squeezing it through the front door of the Vittorio. It didn't much matter once she'd met the whole family anyhow, though. The work and her viewings were just an inkling, usually felt on the small mandible bits of coke that helped her see deeper, harder, and so maybe not even objectively accessible in the work itself. A lower belly intuition that the punter's hurt take on his father was limited and arrested, and maybe unreal. With Joelle makeupless and stone sober and hair in a sloppy knot, the introductory supper with Orin and himself at Legal Seafood up in Brookline. Footnote 309. In the Chestnut Hills Shopping Center on Boylston/Route 9, which the ETAA squad staggers past several times a week on runs, a chain, but a very top shelf and fine one, and the Brookline Legal puts on a particularly fine marine spread, and the Boniface seemed to know Dr. Incandenza and called him by name, and brought him a double bonded without being asked. End of footnote 309. Betrayed nothing much at all, save that the director seemed more than able to resist using Joelle in any capacity. She saw the tall man slump and cringe when Orin told him the pea-goat majored in F&C. Footnote 310. Jargon. Film/cartridge studies. End of footnote 310. Jim had told her later she'd seemed too conventionally, commercially pretty to consider using in any of that period's work, part of whose theoretical project was to militate against received U.S. commercial prettiness conventions, and that Orin was so tense in himself's presence that there wasn't room for any other real emotion at the table. Orin gradually beginning to fill up silences with more and faster nonstop blather, until both Joelle and Jim were embarrassed at the fact that the punter hadn't touched his steamed grouper or given anyone else space for a word of reply. Jim later told Joelle that he simply didn't know how to speak with either of his undamaged sons without their mother's presence and mediation. Orin could not be made to shut up, and Hal was so completely shut down in Jim's presence that the silences were excruciating. Jim said he suspected he and Mario were so easy with each other only because the boy had been too damaged and arrested even to speak to until he was 6, so that both he and Jim had got a chance to become comfortable in mutual silence, though Mario did have an interest in lenses and film that had nothing to do with fathers or needs to please, so that the interest was something truly to share, the two of them. And even when Mario was allowed to work crew on some of Jim's later work, it was without any of the sort of pressures to interact or bond via film that there'd been with Orin and Hal and tennis, at which Jim, Orin informed her, had been a late-blooming junior, but a top collegian. Jim referred to the work's various films as entertainments. He did this ironically about half the time. In the cab that Jim had hailed for them, on the way back home from Legal Seafood, Orin had beaten his fine forehead against the plastic partition and wept that he couldn't seem to communicate with himself without his mother's presence and mediation. It wasn't clear how the moms mediated or facilitated communication between different family members, he said, but she did. He didn't have one fucking clue how himself felt about his abandoning a decade's tennis for punting, Orin wept, or about Orin's being truly great at it, at something, finally. Was he proud or jealously threatened, or judgmental that Orin had quit tennis, or what? The 5 women's rooms' mattresses were too skinny for their frames, and the rims of the frames between the slats were appallingly clotted with dust, with female hair entwined and involved in the dust, so that it took one Kleenex just to wet the stuff down, several dry ones to wipe the muck out. Charlotte Treat had been too sick to shower for days, and her frame and slats were hard to be near. At Joelle's first interface with the whole sad family unit, Thanksgiving, Headmaster's House, ETA, straight on Com Ave in Enfield, Orin's mom's Ms. Incandenza, please do call me Avril, Joelle, had been gracious and warm and attentive without obtruding, and worked unobtrusively hard to put everyone at ease and to facilitate communication, and to make Joelle feel like a welcomed and esteemed part of the family gathering. and something about the woman made every follicle on Joelle's body pucker and distend. It wasn't that Admiral Incandenza was one of the tallest women Joelle had ever seen, and definitely the tallest, pretty older woman with immaculate posture. Dr. Incandenza slumped something awful she'd ever met. It wasn't that her syntax was so artless and fluid and imposing, nor the near sterile cleanliness of the homes downstairs. The bathroom's toilet seemed not only scrubbed but waxed to a high shine. And it wasn't that Avril's graciousness was in any conventional way fake. It took a long time for Joelle even to start to put a finger on what gave her the howling fantods about Orin's mother. The dinner itself, no turkey, some politico-familial in-joke about no turkey on Thanksgiving, was delicious, without being grandiose. They didn't even sit down to eat until 2300 hours. Avril drank champagne out of a little fluted glass, whose level somehow never went down. Dr. Incandenza, no invitation to call him Jim, she noticed, drank at a trifaceted tumbler of something that made the air above it shimmer slightly. Avril put everyone at ease. Orin did credible impressions of famous figures. He and little Hal made dry fun of Avril's Canadian pronunciation of certain diphthongs. Avril and Dr. Incandenza took turns cutting up Mario's salmon. Joelle had a weird half vision of Avril hiking her knife up hilt first and plunging it into Joelle's breast. Hal Incandenza and two other lopsidedly muscular boys from the tennis school ate like refugees and were regarded with gentle amusement. Avril dabbed her mouth in a patrician way after every bite. Joelle wore girl clothes, her dress's neckline very high. Hal and Orin looked vaguely alike. Avril directed every fourth comment to Joel, to include her. Orin's brother Mario was stunted and complexly deformed. There was a spotless doggy dish under the table, but no dog, and no mention was ever made of a dog. Joelle noticed Avril also directed every fourth comment to Orin, Hal, and Mario, like a cycle of even inclusion. There was New York white and Albertan champagne. Dr. Incandenza drank his drink instead of wine and got up several times to freshen his drink in the kitchen. A massive hanging garden behind Avril's and Hal's captain's chairs cut complex shadows into the UV light that made the table's candles glow a weird bright blue. The director was so tall he seemed to rise forever when he rose with his tumbler. Joelle had the queerest, indefensible feeling that Avril wished her ill. She kept feeling different areas of hair stand up. Everybody please and thank you'd in a way that was sheer Yankee wasp. After his second trip to the kitchen, Dr. Incandenza molded his twice-baked potatoes into an intricate futuristic cityscape and suddenly started to discourse animatedly on the 1946 breakup of Hollywood's monolithic studio system and the subsequent rise of the method actors Brando, Dean, Cliff, Al, arguing for a casual connection. His voice was mid-range and mild and devoid of accent. Orin's mom's had to be over 2 meters tall, way taller than Joelle's own personal daddy. Joelle could somehow tell Avril was the sort of female who'd been ungainly as a girl and then blossomed, but who'd only become really beautiful later in life, like 35. She decided Dr. Incandenza looked like an ecologically poisoned crane, she told him later. Ms. Incandenza put everyone at ease. Joelle imagined her with a conductor's baton. She never did tell Jim that Orin called him the mad or sad stork. The whole Thanksgiving table inclined very subtly toward Avril, very slightly and subtly, like heliotropes. Joelle found herself doing it too, the inclining. Dr. Incandenza kept shading his eyes from the UV plant light in a gesture that resembled a salute. Avril referred to her plants as her green babies. At some point out of nowhere, little Hal Incandenza, maybe 10, announced that the basic unit of luminous intensity is the candela, which he defined for no one in particular as the luminous intensity of 1 per 600,000 of a square meter of a cavity at the freezing temperature of platinum. All the table's males wore coats and ties. The larger of Hal's two tennis partners passed out dental stimulators, and no one made fun of him. Mario's grin seemed both obscene and sincere. Hal, whom Joelle wasn't crazy about, kept asking, wasn't anybody going to ask him the freezing temperature of platinum? Joelle and Dr. Incandenza found themselves in a small conversation about Bazin, a film theorist himself detested, making a tormented face at the name. Joelle intrigued the optical scientist and director by explaining Bazin's disparagement of self-conscious directorial expression as historically connected to the neo-Thomist realism of the personalists, an aesthetic school of great influence over French Catholic intellectuals circa 1930 to 1940. Many of Bazin's teachers had been eminent personalists. Avril encouraged Joelle to describe rural Kentucky. Orin did a long impression of late pop astronomer Carl Sagan, expressing televisual awe at the cosmos' scale. Billions and billions, he said. One of the tennis friends burped just awfully, and no one reacted to the sound in any way. Orin said billions and billions and billions in the voice of Sagan. Avril and Hal had a brief, good-natured argument about whether the term circa could modify an interval or only a specific year. Then Hal asked for several examples of something called haplology. Joelle kept fighting urges to slap the sleek little show-offy kid upside the head so hard his bow tie would spin. The universe, Orin continued long, after the wit had worn thin, cold, immense, incredibly universal. The subjects of tennis, baton twirling, and punting never came up. Organized sports were never once mentioned. Joelle noticed that nobody seemed to look directly at Dr. Incandenza except her. A curious, flabby, white, mammarial dome covered part of the academy's grounds outside the dining room's window. Mario plunged his special fork into Dr. Incandenza's potato cityscape, to general applause and certain grating puns on the term deconstruction from the insufferable Hal kid. Everyone's teeth were dazzling in the candlelight and UV. Hal wiped Mario's snout, which seemed to run continuously. Avril invited Joelle, by all means, to make a Thanksgiving call home to her family in rural Kentucky, if she wished. Orin said the mom's was herself originally from rural Quebec. Joelle was on her 7th glass of wine. Orin's fingering his half Windsor kept looking more and more like a signal to somebody. Avril urged Dr. Incandenza to find a way to include Joelle in a production, since she was both a film student and now a heartily welcome honorary addition to the family. Mario, reaching for the salad, fell out of his chair and was helped up by one of the tennis players amid much hilarity. Mario's deformities seemed wide-ranging and hard to name. Joelle decided he looked like a cross between a puppet and one of the big-headed carnivores from Spielberg's old special effects orgies about reptiles. Hal and Avril hashed out whether misspoke was a bona fide word. Dr. Incandenza's tall, narrow head kept inclining toward his plate and then slowly rising back up in a way that was either meditative or tipsy. Deformed Mario's broad smile was so constant you could have hung things from the corners of it. In a fake Southern Belle accent that was clearly no jab at Joelle, more like a Scarlett O'Hara accent, Avril said she did declare that Albertan champagne always gave her the vapors. Joelle noticed that pretty much everybody at the table was smiling, broadly and constantly, eyes shiny in the plant's odd light. She was doing it herself, too, she noticed. Her cheek muscles were starting to ache. Hal's larger friend kept pausing to use his dental stimulator. Nobody else was using their dental stimulator, but everyone held one politely, as if getting ready to use it. Hal and the two friends made odd, spasmic, one-handed squeezing motions periodically. No one seemed to notice. Not once in Orin's presence did anyone mention the word tennis. He had been up half the previous night vomiting with anxiety. Now he challenged Hal to name the freezing point of platinum. Joelle couldn't for the life of her remember either of the names of poor old Spielberg's old computer-enhanced celluloid dinosaur things, though her own daddy had personally taken her to each one. At some point, Orin's father got up to freshen his drink and never returned. Just before dessert, which was on fire, Orin's moms had asked whether they could perhaps all join hands secularly for a moment and simply be grateful for all being together. She made a special point of asking Joelle to include her hands in the hand-holding. Joelle held Orin's hand and Hal's smaller friend's hand, which was so calloused up it felt like some sort of rind. Dessert was Cherry's Jubilee, with gourmet New Brunswick ice cream. Dr. Incandenza's absence from the table went unmentioned, almost unnoticed, it seemed. Both Hal and his non-stimulating friend pleaded for Kahlua, and Mario flapped pathetically at the tabletop in imitation. Avril made a show of gazing at Orin in mock horror as he produced a cigar and clipper. There was also a blanc mange. The coffee was decaf with chicory. When Joelle looked over again, Orin had put his cigar away without lighting it. The dinner ended in a kind of explosion of goodwill. Joelle had felt half crazed. She could detect nothing fake about the lady's grace and cheer toward her, the goodwill, and at the same time felt sure in her guts pit the woman could have sat there and cut out Joelle's pancreas and thymus and minced them and prepared sweetbreads and eaten them chilled and patted her mouth without batting an eye, and unremarked by all who leaned her way. On the way back home, in a cab whose company's phone number Hal had summoned from memory, Orin hung his leg over Joelle's crossed legs and said that if anybody could have been counted on to see that the stork needed to use Joelle somehow, it was the moms. He asked Joelle twice how she'd liked her. Joelle's cheek muscles ached something awful. When they got back to the Brownstone Co-op on that last pre-subsidized Thanksgiving, was the first historical time Joelle intentionally did lines of cocaine to keep from sleeping. Orin couldn't ingest anything during the season, even if he wanted to. BU's major sports teams tested randomly. So Joelle was awake at 0400, cleaning back behind the refrigerator for the second time, when Orin cried out in the nightmare she'd somehow felt should have been hers.